Hi there and welcome. Jonathan here. These talks are offered freely so that no one is ever denied access to these practices. Your support makes a big difference. If you feel inspired to make a donation, please go to jonathanfoust.com. Thank you. There's a story of a big city lawyer from Washington, D.C. who he goes out to the country to do some duck hunting. And he shot a duck, and the duck fell, but it fell into a farmer's field on the other side of the fence. So he climbed over the fence, and this old farmer came racing out in his tractor. And the guy said, "I shot this duck, and I'm getting it." And this old guy said, "No, you're not. It's my property. You can't come on my property." And this lawyer said, "Look, I shot the duck. It's my duck. I'm going to get it." He said, "No, you're not." The guy said, "Look, I am a professional litigator. I can take you to town, and if you really want to play this game, I'm going to take you out." The guy said, "You don't understand living here in a country. We settle things like this with a 3-kick rule." He goes, "Well, what's that?" He said, "Well, I kick you 3 times, and then you kick me 3 times, and we go back and forth until someone gives in." So this lawyer thought, "God, this guy's really old, Sure, what the heck?" So he said, "Go ahead." So this old guy is wearing his farming boots. He kicks him in the knee. He falls down. He kicks him in the stomach, and he kicks him in the head. He's just hurting so terribly. And so he just barely manages to stand. He said, "Okay, it's my turn." And the old guy says, "Nah, you can have the duck." So I've been asked to give a talk on how to keep your heart open during the elections. And somehow that story plays in there. There's been a lot of kicking. And I know that many of us are fed up with the topic, and which is why I think our numbers are down a little bit tonight, which I completely understand. I'm a little self-conscious about speaking on the topic. I'm not a pundit, and I don't play one on TV. And I'm biased. I do have a particular candidate who I feel is better. But I'm also aware, as I was reminded, that there are people here listening to this talk who may have other opinions. And I want to make room for that. So, as unbiased as I can be, I'll just ask for forgiveness in advance. Anything I say, it's really not to be offensive. It's not meant to harm. But when we talk or look at what our culture is going through right now, there are a couple of things I think might be helpful to explore, because what we see externally is a mirror of what's happening internally. And the question is, are we evolving as a culture, or are we devolving? Some people are asking, as evidenced by this. There's something here about seeing the shadow in ourselves and the shadow in our culture, and exploring how do we meet the shadow, and how can we practice what is often referred to in Buddhist psychology as looking for the good. What's good about this? Is there anything that we can take from this that might actually bring about a greater sense of awareness? I was really struck by something that Maharishi Mahesh Yogi said many, many years ago. He said that the elected officials of a country are nothing more than a reflection of the consciousness of the country. So whoever we elect, that is a reflection of the consciousness of the culture. So we've got a very interesting phenomena going on right now. So the question of whether we are evolving or devolving, I found myself kind of reflecting back to, it's been a long time, 15, 20 years ago. The ashram in which I lived was one of the largest communities in North America. And I was one of the administrators there. And I was once contacted by an NBC News program. And they said, we're doing an expose on a certain school of yoga. And I've had my researchers looking for who can we contrast as someone is doing it right. And we've investigated your organization thoroughly, and we want to profile you as someone who's doing it right. Because at that time, there were all these scandals, and all the ashrams, all the spiritual communities were crumbling from sexual abuse, financial abuse, all kind of coming to the light. So I felt very proud and a little smug about that. And then, lo and behold, maybe 6 months later, there was a scandal came forth where the teacher of the community, who had a celibacy vow, was not celibate, had interacted with a number of his students. There was some financial impropriety, and this whole community just fell apart. 300 full-time vowed members of an order, and it just completely collapsed. And what was interesting to me, and again, this is just my perspective, is it just seemed that as that was happening, it was happening everywhere. It wasn't just the spiritual communities, but it was the schools, the churches, the synagogues. It just seemed like there was this rash of power over others was being outed. And it was this kind of massive kind of collapse of these institutions. And I like to think of it as an evolutionary process, that somehow our culture is no longer willing to tolerate that kind of behavior. And so it was seen. And a lot of organizations fell apart. We brought in, it was a fair bit of trauma in our culture. People had spent 20 years there as vowed members. We brought in an organization that focused on sexual misconduct in the clergy, and what was so interesting about that was we realized we were not unique. That every organization that goes through this goes through kind of a classical response, from those who want to burn the church down to those who defend the church, to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, as you become more awake, you begin to see what's not awake. That's what happens in meditation practice. You begin to see the parts of you that are not fully alive. You begin to see the parts of you that are tight or congested. So does it feel in our culture that there's more divisiveness in general? Does it feel like we're a more violent culture than before? It seems that way to me, but there's a very interesting book, which you may be familiar with, by Steven Pinker, called The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. And he argues that violence has declined in both the long run and the short run, and he offers a number of explanations. But there's a lot of statistical work that he has done that really points to that this is actually one of the least violent times in human history. When you look at the number of wars, when you look at the number of democracies, when you look at slavery levels, all of that. And he gives an interesting example. He says that, and again, this is Steven Pinker saying that the rate of rape has gone down somewhat dramatically in our culture. But because of the vanishing communications gap, the number of recordings has given the impression that there's more. He also says that this decline in violence is not smooth, And it's not guaranteed to continue. But his studies are demonstrating this. And there are a couple of reasons why he says there's less violence. And these are the reasons he gives. He says there are more monopolies. There are more monopolies of power. And along with it, there's more commerce through these monopolies. And there's a recognition that there are more trading partners and less of a desire to interrupt trade because everything is more interrelated. There's also a growing awareness of feminization. A respect for the interests and values of women is a global phenomena. The other reason he mentions is cosmopolitanism, that there is a rising rate of literacy around the planet, and the rise of mass media has helped people to get other people's perspectives. The final reason he mentions is what he calls the escalator of reason, that there's a more intensive application of knowledge and rationality, which is helping to point out the futility of violence. I take great heart in that possibly we're becoming more aware as a species. And maybe becoming more aware of the futility of violence and some of the antidotes to violence. And Pinker mentions 4. The first one is empathy, the practice of empathy, the capacity to feel or imagine what another person is experiencing. The second is self-control, recognizing the consequences of acting impulsively. The third is a moral sense, that's kind of adjusting your norms and the taboos that support interconnectivity. And the fourth is reason, using logic to shift from a small self to the larger whole. So those 4 qualities are qualities that cultivate consciousness, to become aware of the other, to become aware of your actions and the effect of your actions, to become aware of what is skillful and what is not skillful, and to call on reason and logic rather than raw emotion. So I take heart at that perspective. And I know that for each of us, we're each trying to become more aware, to access greater empathy and compassion for ourselves and for others. And as you become self-aware, as I often joke, you feel better. You feel your sadness better, you feel your rage better, you feel your depression better, along with your capacity for joy and wisdom and compassion. But what you also really get to develop is your capacity to work and be with the unknown, or to be and work with the shadow. You may have seen an article that Deepak Chopra wrote a couple months ago about the shadow and how he sees the shadow playing out in our political field. So a lot of what I'm going to reference is what he said. But I'd also like to tie it into how it's a mirror for our own practice. He talked of how in Europe, kind of at the height of civilized culture, when World War I began, it began almost gleefully, with people excited to go off to war for the glory of war. And it quickly turned into this horror show, kind of this insidious trap. Deepak Chopra talks about how with the election that one of the candidates stands for something universal. And that is the shadow. that's something we're embarrassed or we're ashamed of. Carl Jung talks about the shadow and how it comes from Freud's insight that our psyches are dualistic, that there's the conscious and then there's the unconscious. Of course, we talk a lot about in meditation of how the line between conscious and unconscious moves. The more you relax and pay attention, the more you become aware of what's below the line. So the shadow is all the places we don't want to touch. It includes hatred, aggression, selfishness, jealousy, resentment, sexual transgression, and it's usually off to the side. And when we're not willing to look at the shadow, at times the shadow will erupt. And we're shocked, like it shouldn't be there, or it isn't there. And so there are political figures throughout history that have unleashed the shadow. They've given a respectability to racism. They've called for law and order against minorities. And they've created an us versus them, creating enemies. So one of the candidates has kind of allowed himself to kind of let the shadow out. And there are millions of people who are cheering in approval. So just as we see this externally, it's a mirror of our internal process. Everything that is undigested in your life, your anger, your resentments, your unmet needs, they're there. And it takes courage to really look at that shadow, of what it has to say, what those needs are. We all have a capacity for ill will and hatred, wanting to assert our dominion over others or avoid others dominating us, feeling a lack of resources, feeling threatened, feeling competition, feeling insecurity. And so if we don't acknowledge the shadow, it'll either recede in the background and pop up again, or it'll become more rampant unless we really address it. So what Deepak Chopra said in this article, which I found helpful, particularly when I just get overwhelmed with all the feelings that come with the rhetoric that's being thrown around these days. He says, number one, view the phenomena as a confrontation with the shadow. And second, instead of demonizing the speaker or those who follow him, it's important to acknowledge that everyone has the shadow inside of them. The third thing he says is remember that the shadow, in the end, never wins. The fourth is to find every opening to reinforce the value of returning to reason and compassion in your own life. Just remember that refuge of seeing clearly, seeing what is true, and the refuge of compassion. The fifth, he says, is do not fight the shadow with the shadow, which means not stooping to play by nihilistic rules. The shadow is always willing to go one lower than you're willing to go. Hence the 3-kick rule. So when we look at the evolving brain, we have at the stem of the brain is the reptilian brain, which is all about safety and all about self-protection, having what you need. Kind of growing over, evolving beyond the reptilian brain is the mammalian brain. And the mammalian brain is about tribe, it's about emotions, and it's some relational quality to it. And then there's the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex has to do with self-awareness. It has to do with the capacity to recognize the other in yourself and yourself in the other. It opens you to interconnectedness and to new possibilities. So when we play into the shadow, when we reinforce the shadow, we reinforce the reptilian brain, which is all about being right, all about revenge, all about avoiding domination. When we can use these practices to cultivate and develop the prefrontal cortex, we can begin to recognize that what we are reactive to in another is also within us. We recognize that we have a resource of wisdom and compassion. Not that it's easy. But when we see the shadow, there's the possibility to counter the shadow with empathy and with compassion. Part of what has risen from so much of the media and all the words being thrown around is, for some people, kind of a re-traumatizing of their shadow experiences. This is from Slate magazine. 35 years ago, Beth Anderson was raped by a man who'd offered her a ride home. Unlike most victims, she found a modicum of justice. Her rapist was arrested and after a plea bargain served a year and a day in prison. I moved on, says Anderson, now 56 and a web developer living in a small town in Wisconsin. I was able to separate all that out. It's never bothered me until right now. All over America, this denouement of the Trump campaign is forcing women to think anew about the abuse that they've endured. According to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, the weekend after the release of the Trump tape saw a 33% increase in people turning to its national sexual assault hotline for support. Traffic to the website was up 45%. I have to say I'm very concerned for a lot of women out there because I was brought back by that statement, something that happened to me when I was a young woman. Michelle Obama spoke for many when she said that this attitude for women has shaken me to my core in a way that I couldn't have predicted. So it seems that there is this very, very deep triggering among many people in our culture that has sort of erupted through this process. The practice, of course, is when we encounter something unpleasant. Just to reiterate the classic practice of RAIN, R-A-I-N. The R is to recognize it, to see it for what it is. The A, if you can allow it, accept it, make room for it. The I is to be intimate with it, to investigate it. And the N is to nurture it with awareness, to nurture it with compassion. So while for some this re-triggering of the shadow may be re-traumatizing, there's a possibility for others it can be an opportunity for healing. Just as when the ashram I was living in was melting down, it wasn't as if we had discovered sexual abuse for the first time. It was there all the time. We just never saw it. So something about seeing it can be very, very helpful. So the voice that has been expressed has millions of followers, millions of people who feel that this voice is speaking for them. What does that voice have to say? And this leads us to a very integral part of accessing empathy, which is to ascertain the unmet need. When we don't get what we need or we're hoping for, we react, often in anger. There's a very interesting element here I'd just like to touch on briefly about the 6 human needs that we have. And this is not from any Buddhist text, it's from the text of Sri Tony Robbins. But I find it really helpful. If you imagine sort of the extremes of right wing, left wing, the first need that we have is for certainty. We want to feel safe, and we want to trust, and we want to feel like everything's okay. So you can imagine how from one side there's a certain degree of certainty that we have a need for. The other has their own need. The second need we have is for uncertainty. We like to be stimulated. We like new things. And that is a need we all have. The third is a need for significance, to have a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. The fourth is a sense of connection, to feel like we're connected with others, like we're with our tribe. The fifth is a need for growth, to feel like we're developing, that there are new possibilities, that we're becoming something better. And the sixth need is to feel a contribution, like we're making a difference in the world. So these 6 needs are all part of what each of us as humans carry inside of ourselves. We have different interpretations of how those needs can be met. But it's very, very helpful to recognize that when there is anger, anger is an unmet need. What is the need under that display of aggression that we see out there? To ask that question is a powerful question, because you can't ask that question without beginning to do a role reversal, without having to begin to imagine what another person is feeling. And when you do that, you're activating the prefrontal cortex, and you're activating the evolving brain. One of the most helpful things I have seen in my life, being quite conflict averse, is seeing that whenever I'm presented with anger, I'm much more able to translate that into an unmet need. What is the need behind that anger? And it's important to ask ourselves that when we see so many people who are so angry and upset. So here's something that Thich Nhat Hanh said. He said, I have noticed that people are dealing too much with the negative, with what is wrong. They do not touch enough on what is not wrong. Why not try the other way, to look into the patient to see positive things, to just touch those things and make them bloom? And this is a very helpful practice, to look for the good, to train yourself to look for the good. So I thought I would try that one on this particular topic. I read an article not that long ago. And again, it's along the lines of this woman who was whose sexual abuse was triggered by all this talk of abuse and having it so present in the media. And it was the story of a 75-year-old woman who also had a memory of sexual abuse come to her recently, again, because of the media dialogue and having it so out there. And the story was very, very powerful. She was 75 years old, had been married for, 45 years. And she told her husband. That was a secret that she never told anyone before. And there's a very interesting phrase that says, what you can't communicate controls you. If there's something you can't say, it's locked inside. And it's locked not only in your speech, but it's locked in your behavior. She was able to tell her husband. And he was able to listen. And he was able to empathize, which was part of her healing. So something in her shadow arose. She was able to recognize it. She was able to make room for it. She was able to be intimate with it. And she was able, as a gesture of her own healing, to share it and have it be heard and witnessed. That's really what a meditation practice is all about. It's what a commitment to cultivating non-judging awareness is all about. It's all about when something arises from your shadow, whatever that may be, can you meet it? Can you recognize it? Can you make room for it? Can you hold it in compassion? Can you hold it with empathy? Can you ask what it needs? That is the evolving brain. It's the evolving practice, and it's a larger part of the culture we're in right now. So I asked myself, what's good about this? Here are some suggestions. There's a possibility, I think, of acknowledging this phenomena through this election as an encounter with the shadow. That if we can meet the shadow, possibly it can heal in some fashion. There's a possibility of recognizing that the millions of people who ascribe to that point of view have needs. They have true and resonant needs. Many of these people are angry, they're scared, they're hurt. Many people have had their prospects erode. And for some of those, if their needs were met, there could be a shift. For others, I think there's a recognition that we are changing, we are evolving, and some kind of education is required as well. The Arizona governor recently said, Latinos don't vote. And I think maybe because of that statement, they will. And so actually I feel like there's something about this process that is coalescing those who feel they don't have a voice to actually step up to have a voice, which could be very, very powerful. And we'll see how many people are drawn out to express themselves through voting. But inevitably for those who vote once, it becomes a habit, which invokes a lot more civic activity. Another thing that might be good about this is, as a nation, we kind of blew our opportunity to judge other nations. Wherever right-wing extremism has come up in other nations, we don't have the high ground anymore. So it actually forces us to empathize, to really own who we are. Another good thing is that many people are having to actually declare where they stand. Many politicians are having to declare where they stand. There's not much chance for obfuscation anymore, which again brings things a little bit clearer. And yet another thing that I think we can actually celebrate is, as wretched as this process has been, we live in a system that actually allows this to come up. And hopefully to come up, to be expressed, so that we can evolve beyond this, if that's possible. And I'm not sure it is. I think there are fewer secrets, which can be a good thing. And there's also something about this process, as challenging as it has been, as polarizing as it has been, the possibility for generating some real meaningful discussion. Again, when we look at Steven Pinker's guidelines, how violence decreases when we practice empathy, the capacity to see another's point of view. when we see our interconnectivity, when we draw on rationality, that there are new possibilities that emerge. Mahatma Gandhi said that those who say that spirituality has nothing to do with politics do not know what spirituality really means. And that really begs the question, well, what is the spiritual response to what's going on around us? And the answer, I think, lies in those four qualities of the heart. That when the heart is fully expressed without restriction, you have access to compassion for yourself and for others. You have access to kindness for yourself and for others. You have access to joy, and you have access to a kind of steadiness, that no matter what the fluctuations are externally, you have access to a certain quality of inner steadiness. When we are informed by anger, we have a certain degree of effectiveness in the world. When we're informed through compassion and kindness, we have a different quality of effectiveness in the world. And it's interesting how so many of those leaders who have affected such change on the planet, when we think of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Mandela, etc., that is what they drew upon. Calling upon our interconnectivity and the possibility of evolving as a culture. There's a beautiful phrase, again, when we think of where do we begin where there's so much discord? And many of the great teachings say that the place to begin is in your own heart. If there is not peace in your own heart, there will not be peace in the world. And you begin in concentric circles, yourself, your intimate circle, your community, your city, your state, and let it expand outward. That, I think, is one of the most challenging things for us to do in a world filled with so much strife, is to recognize that it begins inside. It begins with kindness, compassion, and joy and equanimity, and the capacity to move out of reactivity, but to really listen, and then to speak and act from wisdom and from compassion. Very easy to say, not so easy to do. Why don't we close with a short yet brief meditation? You might take a few moments to feel your breath. And just sense, if it's not possible, if just for a few minutes, to cultivate a sense of peace in your heart. Just the sense, the possibility that in these moments there's nothing to add, there's nothing to take away from right now. You might think of those in your inner circle who may be experiencing their shadow, their fear, their anger, their undigested life experience. Anyone you know who's struggling in your inner circle, and you might just wish them well. Wish them ease. And you might imagine just over the next minute that this light of compassion might begin to expand. Let it radiate out to the person to your left and right and front, behind. Letting it expand through this room, wishing everyone in this room well. Imagine you might let that radiate out to all beings in all directions without discrimination. May all beings feel peace. May all beings feel safe from inner and outer harm. May all beings feel free from suffering. And as you offer that out, imagine that you could simultaneously again offer it to yourself, to this breath and to each cell of your body. And when you're ready, you can deepen your breath. And as you're ready, you can let your eyes open. Thank you for your time and your attention. Any feedback you have that's negative, you can send it to Bob Geyer. I'll send you his email address. Again, I ask for any forgiveness in my stumbling or lack of insight. A few quick announcements. First of all,